There's a lot going on with this stamp. This is a United States stamp for 25 cents, and it is commemorating Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, an American explorer who is being recognized for his contribution to the exploration of Antarctica. Alongside his portrait, we can see the ship that he used in his Antarctic expedition, and in the background we can see the outline of the Antarctic continent. The final thing to point out is the white jagged line that is mapping his expedition around a portion of Antarctica. Looking further into it, this stamp was issued back in 1988. I can definitely take this episode a number of different directions. Lieutenant Charles Wilkes is an interesting character. He's got a controversial story about his expedition around the world. But because this stamp comes in a set of 4, featuring 4 American explorers of Antarctica, I want to take this around the route of looking into their contributions into the discovery and exploration of the continent. But for me to do that, I selected 3 additional stamps featuring non-American explorers that really had a big part in Antarctica's history. Now, I can tell we're going to have a lot of fun with this because reading into each of these guys, their stories are epic, and it all starts with just looking at Antarctica. Now, when I think of Antarctica, I think of that slither that runs at the bottom of a map, but it's actually quite strange to see it in its true shape. It is, of course, a continent covered in snow and ice. And this is actually a big piece of land. It's more than 4 times the size of India, almost twice the size of Australia, and the continental US can fit in there quite comfortably. And what's interesting is that it's also, well, it's also the coldest, the windiest, and believe it or not, the driest continent on the planet. This continent gets such a small amount of precipitation in terms of snow and ice that it's technically a desert. This snow that's blowing around right now is just blowing from the different glaciers, and this ice has been around for thousands of years. So it truly is a frozen desert. And did I mention it was cold? Now let's go through the lineup of the 7 explorers, starting with the earliest, Nathaniel Palmer. Now there were sightings of Antarctica before him, but he was the first American explorer to lay eyes on what is the Antarctic Peninsula, nearby South America. The next explorer is the one we pulled, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, who actually mapped out what is the eastern side of Antarctica, nearby Australia. Charles Wilkes is the reason why Antarctica was then acknowledged as a continent and started to get drawn on maps. Now, the next explorer is the first of the non-Americans, Ernest Shackleton from Britain. And he makes a really good attempt at trying to reach the South Pole, falling just 97 miles short before having to turn around. Now, Shackleton is actually known for a different adventure in the Antarctic, where he tried to cross from one side to the other, but his ship got stuck in the ice and he was stranded with his men for almost 2 years before being rescued. So this particular stamp of Shackleton actually has images of his ship in the ice, a famous photograph that was taken at the time. Now this is where things get crazy interesting. We've got an explorer from Norway and one from England who actually race to try get to the South Pole. The Norwegian was Roald Amundsen, and the Englishman is Robert Scott. Now, Roald Amundsen actually becomes the first man to make it to the South Pole, whereas Scott had some trouble along the way and was doing some science experiments. He gets there 2 weeks later to see a Norwegian flag already planted in the ground. Now, Robert Scott was devastated that he did not win the race to the pole, and what makes matters worse is that on his way back, his men began to die, and unfortunately, Scott perished before he was able to make it back to his base. Next we have Richard Byrd. Now, he builds an American base on the west end of the Ross Ice Shelf, and he flies from there to the South Pole, becoming the first person to make a flight directly to the pole and back. His base was known as Little America, and it's important because the next stamp involves Lincoln Ellsworth. Now, Ellsworth attempts to make a trans-Antarctic flight, but along the way he loses fuel and has to make an emergency landing nearby that base that Richard Byrd built, Little America. As a result, he was stranded there for 2 weeks before he was rescued. Now, as I mentioned about Wilkes, these other explorers have a fascinating story behind them, and I've just given a very watered down history of the exploration of Antarctica. But there are many more explorers and many more stories that you can definitely look into. Let's hope the next stamp I pull is about a tropical island. Thanks for watching, everyone. Definitely hit subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, happy collecting.